Here's a great strategy stat. I love this stat that Ryan pulled for us from the McKinsey Quarterly, which was published, this one was published in March of this year. So I think the big challenge with strategic planning is actually taking that last step of connecting the strat plan with your budget and the resources. And so easier said than done from time to time, but really good organizations allocate, as you can see, allocate the resources to their strategic priorities, and that, of course, yields the returns and dividends that shareholders are hoping for and expecting, and so you can kind of see the outcome of that and the higher than average shareholder returns for those companies that allocate their resources, aka their capital, to their strategic goals. And so that continues to be, I know that continues to be a challenge. So there's another data point for why that's so important to go through that component of the process. So without further ado, let's jump into the meat of the day, and I'll read the question, and then I think Elsa's going to tackle this one. So really good question. What sort of timing should I set with my team for how long it should take to develop a strategic plan and work through all the steps in your system? And this was submitted in relation to the MyStrategicPlan system. We know that not everybody is necessarily using that, so we'll focus the answer on just sort of how long does it take to develop a strategic plan.
Thanks, Erica. You know, we like to use a rule of thumb of about 3 to 4 months, but it really depends on the size of your company, the dynamics of your company, what's going on, how many departments, divisions. But for the most part, 3 to 4 months time period. We've been working with organizations that most recently that have taken about 6 months for a very, very solid plan to be developed and their implementation started. I think that if you're having problems in this area, a great place to start is on our online tool, Virtual Strategy Guide. You can find that at www.mystrategicplan.com under the Resource tab. You can easily go to that section, follow the Virtual Strategy Guide, and look at the phases, because we have given time allocations for each of the phases. So real good rule of thumb, start with a 3 to 4 month time period. Again, assessing your own company will give you an idea, and then where they are in the process. Yeah.
And also something just to add to the thought on this too, I know that, in fact, we're just having a conversation about this morning about the planning process being married up with the organizational development and where you are in your organizational sophistication, if you will, and where your leadership is and the thoughts on leadership. Not only yourself, but also your direct reports and how strong that group is. That sort of dictates how long or not a strategic planning process could take. And maybe another thought on that too is, and the reason we say 3 or 4 months is to make sure you get your upfront information from your stakeholders, but also to kind of move sort of quickly through the process, because everyone really believes right now, I know all of us do as well on the line, is that concept of having an agile plan. So we're not looking for a perfect 5-year written in stone, document. We're looking for a plan that's potentially rolling, such that you create the long-term direction and then those annualized components. And that makes the planning process a little bit less laborious, I would say.
Absolutely, absolutely. Giving your staff also a real good definitive maybe timeline so they get a clear understanding. Not only that, keeping them engaged. So if there's any training that needs to occur in order to get them all maybe to an even playing field for starting the plan, as well as a process that will keep them engaged and keep them excited about moving through the different phases. I think that that's very important, especially if there is a learning curve for, a component of your group.
That's a great point too. We don't always think about the need to train the team on strategic planning itself, right? Oftentimes we kind of just jump in. I know we do that with our clients. Normally we just sort of jump on in and you learn through osmosis. But if you have the opportunity and the time for people to learn about the strategic planning process before actually getting into the development of your strategic plan, that's hugely useful. Again, on the resource section of my strategic plan, there's all the videos and the information and resources that can onboard your staff. So, yeah. Okay, great question. let's hop to the next one. And you can see that we're kind of highlighting the key points as we're going through here, and as Ryan mentioned, we'll send out the deck afterwards. So, Elsa, you want to read this one?
I have found that the most frustrating challenge to strategic planning effectiveness is developing a methodical way to monetize the investment, time, people, resources. I need to prove an ROI. So I need to do this to justify the investment just like any other project or system. I don't believe it should be so narrow as focusing on a single revenue goal or simplistic as aggregating the metrics of a few goals. But that is what I'm looking at. Do you have any recommendations on how we can do this better?
So that's
a mouthful.
That is a mouthful. So I think that's a really interesting question. The nuts and bolts of it, of course, being, how do we prove that strategic planning makes a difference? And so, we have done some research ourselves on does strategic planning and a commitment to strategic planning actually does it drive bottom line results? And that's what we're looking at with our ROI, right? The return on investment of the time, and if you're using external resources invested in the strategic planning process. So the research that we found resulted in the fact that those that had a stronger commitment to strategic management, so that is not just the planning but the execution of it, showed a 12% bottom line increase and an 11% top line increase greater than those that didn't. So this is in addition to business as usual, and this is also, this research was done a couple of years ago, so it's subject to change given economic conditions. But the point of, the end point of our research did result in the fact that those organizations that committed to a strategic management process did show a bottom line and a top line increase more than those that didn't. But I think what's interesting about this is strategic management, I call it, it's considered a secondary business process. Primary business processes being, budgeting, human resource management, that type of stuff. And so strategic planning or strategic management tends to fall in that, well, we kind of should do it, we know we should, but we don't have to. And that's sort of true, actually. You sort of don't have to. And I think that the compelling reason to have a rigorous, effective strategic management process in place as part of your standard operating procedures is because of the all of the tangential benefits of aligning those resources and people of the time and money that we have towards those critical things that we're actually trying to get accomplished. And those great companies do that. And I think Jim Collins' recent book, Great by Choice, really hammers home the idea around paranoid productivity. And you can't be paranoid about your productivity and paranoid about where you're headed if we're not all headed in the same direction and everything's sort of adding up to the same set of goals. And that's fairly simplistic, but very true. So, Elsa, what are any thoughts to add to that? Any kind of recent experience as we've been working through this as well with other organizations?
It's really interesting because I was just asked by a healthcare administrator, everything seems to be going well in our organization. I can't seem to prove return on investment when we do strategic planning, so, what's the benefit? And so this kind of leads us into an area, and I don't want to stray away from this question, but again, if we have all of the facets of our organization totally aligned so that we have a real good balance, we're working on all components of the organization, can you imagine how much better it would be financially if we do invest and focus on all of the resources that are available to us? So again, because we aren't maybe tracking return on investment in the more intangible ways, leads us to believe that we don't need strategic planning. But for the most part, to see return on investment, get everything in line, make all of the facets of the organization work, and you'll start seeing a return on investment. You'll be able to know where you were a year ago and where you will be in a year and a half, and know that it has benefited the organization. You may be one of those organizations that experiences a 12 to 15% improvement on your bottom line.
That's right.
Absolutely.
I think it also, on its face value, we all think that strategic planning is the obvious and right thing to do and the right way to run a business, right? So I think that that's an organization, and I think that's just kind of probably a core belief. It's kind of it's like somebody said yesterday in one of my sessions, it's like disagreeing with motherhood. We're not going to do that, right? But what we can criticize is the over-processing of a strategic planning process, and I think a lot of us have been involved in those over-processed planning engagements where, quite honestly, we are eroding the ROI and the benefits of planning because we're doing more of the planning than we are of the execution, and that you've tipped to the wrong side. And I think the last one last point on this too is, ultimately we're trying to make more certain the future that we're striving to achieve, right? And so I mentioned to somebody else the other day, I said, if you're not trying to be in a different place tomorrow than you are today, then you don't need a strategic plan. And ultimately, the result of your strategic plan should be those metrics that are in your plan, and then moving the dial on those metrics. And we don't just get to set metrics and ask for movement on metrics without an underlying set of things to make that happen, right? AKA employee retention or, customer satisfaction or all of those things.
And that's the best way to validate return on investment. If you have your goals written in a way that you definitely can measure them, that you can track how you're doing, then obviously that is going to be the clear-cut way to get you to understand what your return is on your time and investment of resources. Absolutely.
Yeah. Whew. Okay.
That was a mouthful.
Big one.
Great question.
So I am jumping into the next question here. And you know what? I'll read this for you, Elsa. Public sector goals are difficult when applying measures. How do we apply measures to goals that seem unmeasurable? So that's one question. And then sort of a sister question with that is, we are a nonprofit, and I get pushback on my nonprofit plan being too metric focused. I don't want to ignore the pushback, and I need to address the concerns head on. What measures should we use to track our goals?
This is one that has come up a lot lately. We work with a lot of public sector organizations that are having trouble identifying how to measure their goals. They seem and I hate to use the term, almost long-winded. How do I put my arms around this one? And a good place to start then is looking at how the goal is written. The goal has to be very concise. It has to measure one thing. It has to be focused on measuring one element. And so, we've had several examples lately, and I'm going to use one that just came up most recently from two organizations in 1 week. Water treatment. Many public health departments are responsible for water treatment. And so, and it's fascinating that this one would come up twice, but how do we measure? How do we measure goals in the water treatment area? And so if the goal is written in a way that it is unmeasurable, then it is very hard to put your arms around it. But, I am of this, thought that everything can be measured to a certain definitely to a certain point. If you're testing the water quality of your community, and let's just use that as an example, and I would definitely identify what it is that you want to accomplish. What is the outcome that you're trying to achieve? And then write the goal in a way that you can measure progress on that goal, either through metrics or through progress on the goal. And then if you are having trouble identifying what progress is on a goal, then I would just list out maybe the chain of events that need to occur in order to achieve that outcome that you want to achieve, and then set those metrics in place. Maybe in 3 months you want to be at a certain place, and 6 months you want to be at another place. So that is a form of measuring your progress on that goal. Now, if it's metrics, if you're actually looking for water quality and certain metrics, then those are the targets that you're going to apply to that goal, and you're going to maybe set elements that or different timelines and a different value that you want to achieve. Maybe it's 6 months, at a year, at 18 months, and so forth. So again, everything is measurable, but first of all, writing the goal in a way that it can be measured, and then secondly, break it up in small chunks so that it's easy to digest. Don't write a goal so obscurely that you can't put your arms around it, that you don't know how to figure out where you are on that goal and how you're accomplishing the goal, what your progress is on that goal. So any thoughts on that?
About the outcome, right?
Yeah, what is the outcome you're trying to achieve?
Outcome? And that's what's cool, I think, we get really worried about metrics sometimes, I think, because A, they're hard to come up with. From time to time they can be, as mentioned on the water quality thing, although it's an interesting example. And then also just because then we have to go, there's an accountability component that's sort of fundamentally built into metrics, and also the concept of how we actually going to source that information, which can take time or be actually hard to source. So, but what I think that what's cool about metrics, though, on that first point is the fact that it really drives home what is the outcome, like where are we trying to go with this thing that we want to do. And the other thing that we talk a lot about is the ideal place is that we actually have measures that matter, measures that are telling us, measures that are meaningful, measures that are telling us whether or not we're making progress. And so when we get public sector feedback or we get nonprofit feedback about the fact that, it feels too businessy, my answer back to that would be to say, well, okay, so what is it that we can put in place, whether it's hard metrics or soft measures, and I'll talk about that in a minute, that will help us tell the story about our progress. And certainly every organization, really every organization, but nonprofits and certainly the public sector organizations right now really need to tell the story to the public and to their funding sources about the progress and the results that they're delivering based on either taxpayer dollars or, for nonprofits, grant money or funding or whatever it is, right?
Absolutely.
So on the soft metrics, so there's the tell your story, measures that matter, measures that are meaningful. And the soft side of that is what my strategic plan has built into it, we call the stoplight measures, red, green, yellow. And some organizations that we work with, even though they have hard metrics, like to just use the red, green, yellow status, and that makes it a little bit more palatable. In fact, we pulled up that example for Las Vegas that had the city of Las Vegas had a fabulous report card, progress report that really was, red, green, yellow stuff, and it was effective. It was very effective in telling the story, and it also gets away from feeling too metric heavy.
When they did publish their results on progress, it was a very nice way of delivering it to their public. It was a very, very easy way to follow. It showed progression on their various initiatives, and I think that it was well received by those key stakeholders that needed to understand how are we doing on our goals for the community. It's a very, very good piece, good communication piece to their public.
I'll just leave the questionnaire with two resources on this point. One is for public sector organizations, the ICMA. I'm sure you're probably familiar with that. That's a City and County Managers Association, has a pretty heavy metric initiative, if you will. And so they've got a lot of ideas. Sometimes it's just about ideas, tons of ideas there. And then there's a book that we use, and I think it's by I think the first guy's name is Ken Permanente or something like that. But either way, it's actually called Key Performance Indicators. That's like the name of it. Pretty straightforward. And it's a book of different key performance indicators. And again, sometimes you just need ideas. So that's a resource. Okay, excellent. Let's hop into the next question. Also, what do we have going next?
Any tips to avoid becoming so engrossed in current problems and the tactics of others that insufficient time is spent on long-range planning, the purpose of strategic planning?
Yeah, great question. I would add into that maybe the whole idea of just, talking about underlying, not only long-range planning, but sort of underlying strategy, how we doing? Not only how we're doing, but where, are we moving in the right direction, and is what we thought about a year ago the right strategy? So, the simple answer to this is the idea of holding, and I sound like a broken record on this, holding quarterly business reviews. And a lot of times our quarterly business reviews are just report outs, and unfortunately that's not really the only point. It's a point, certainly is a point to report on progress of goals, but the better place to be in those sessions is to really be talking about what's changing and shifting in the landscape, and how does our strategy then need to change and shift. So the point is to have a half a day, and if you even had a day, that's, some organizations can choose to make that time, with their leadership team to spend the day on a quarterly basis talking, scheduling to talk about one part, how we're doing, the two other parts, if you will, broken it down into three core issues related to the strategic direction of the organization, and that tends to up the ante of not getting overrun by those tactical fire drills that we all live with on a day-to-day basis. Because, at the end of the day, we as leaders have to block out the thinking space. We really have to block out the thinking space to do that big thinking, and it's not going to happen in 1 hour shoved in between, doing a performance review and calling a customer maybe, hypothetically. So that's my simple answer to that question.
I would definitely, if some time has to be devoted to operational issues and a lot of tactics, then separate the two. Clearly have a time designated to where you spend another hour just dealing with the operational issues, because those don't go away, and a lot of tactical issues need to be addressed, so address them, but don't confuse the two, or else you could get sucked into just talking about tactics and not thinking of the long-range plan.
And it's easier, it's easier, like mentally, it's easier to talk about the tactics. It's easier to talk about runway-level stuff. It's harder to talk about the strategic initiatives, if you will, and so human nature gravitates, and we've all watched it happen, right? We've watched the strategy section of our agendas get overrun with, okay, we just got to cover this one thing, issue. And I think, the salient point on this, which is a great quote, that operations eats strategy for lunch. And I think that's really, really true. So I think that the net on this is book the time, right? Schedule the time, and make it pure, and go into those sessions really well prepped, so you actually are prepared to talk about strategy and long-range planning, which does take some preparation, and we all know that. So,
and very briefly on that, it will take a fire marshal, Bob, somebody that's saying this is tactical, this is
that's true.
So have somebody calling people on it. That's always a good place to be if you have those that really want to spend their time on tactics.
Yeah.
So great question. Thank you very much for the question.
That's an awesome question. Yeah. Okay. So Elsa, this one's for you. I am running a strategic planning meeting next month for our team, and I'm looking for some new, fresh ideas to lead a mission statement. I want to set expectations high and set it the right way with this initial exercise. Any ideas for a fun, productive mission statement creation exercise? I have an idea on this question.
Great.
Let's flip this for a minute, because Elsa just did the coolest thing last week, and she facilitated a really fun exercise related to vision. And I think vision can be a lot more fun and creative than mission, quite honestly. And so let's answer, how do we facilitate a fun vision exercise, because we're trying to get the fun factor here. And then and I'll share some ideas on mission. So Elsa, share with us how you helped the organization last week develop their vision.
Well, we had a great exercise where the organization had an opportunity to think about a publication that was that had been printed on their organization in the year 2022, and what would that publication say about their company in the year 2022? What were the headlines about their company? What was the cover story about their company? What did the images look like? How were they going to look to the public at that time? And so everyone had an opportunity to really brainstorm and come together with some great ideas. It got them thinking about what the company could be in 10 years. And I think that was the exciting part of it, but then narrowing it down and circling it around and kind of synthesizing it to what those common themes were. But ultimately, they had a lot of fun with it, and I had a lot of great comments about the exercise, and it really did give them an opportunity to envision. And no idea was a bad idea. That's a great place to start.
Oh, that's so true.
Yeah.
No, that's right. So that's exercises borrowed from Grove Consultants. They are a visual facilitation company. They do great work, and they that idea is really that kind of getting at the question of where do we want to be without addressing it head on, which is kind of fun. Did you have some wacky, crazy stuff come up?
Oh, of course, and it's really interesting. I told him, you'll always have the most interesting personalities that seem like they're maybe not the ones that are going to draw pictures and everything. You actually have people drawing pictures because they're envisioning and maybe can't put it into words, but they actually get that pen out and start drawing pictures. But yeah, they had some great ideas on the publications because they get to pick their own publication. And so, you had anything from the Wall Street Journal to their local newspapers. So I think the Wall Street Journal was the great one because the Wall Street Journal actually even had a picture on it, which was great.
How fun. So then that exercise goes, you pulled out the main themes from what everybody shared out, right, from their cover story ideas.
Everyone got to share out, and then we listened for those common threads, that common thread that was heard, and we jotted those down, and then we were able to synthesize it, or to break it down, kind of narrow it up, come up with one statement that kind of represented the whole group's perspective as to where they would be in 2022. It was really exciting. I thought it was a really good way to get the creative juices going, but mainly it got everybody's idea out and discussed, and everyone had an opportunity to see what the other table or the other group might have, how they saw the company. And so, yeah, maybe something they might have missed, somebody else didn't. So it got a very, very good sampling of a vision for the company. Yeah, and I bet there's some great fun things that you can do with that mission statement.
I always kind of make trade-offs between funness, between mission and vision, so I tend to err on the fun factor for vision, to be totally honest. And normally our process for developing mission statements is always before we embark on a strategic planning engagement, we do, of course, a participant survey. And the reason for doing that is not to, ask people about their job satisfaction, but rather to get people's feedback on specific parts of the strategic plan, for example, the mission. And so I think people loathe doing mission statements as a group because it turns into a wordsmithing exercise, and it's just really boring in that regard. And so what we've done successfully is to pull in, pull people's feedback in advance. And then when we walk into the session, we've got up on the whiteboard or we've got up on flip charts the main ideas around mission. In addition to that, in advance, we do ask people to kind of go look at other mission statements and see which ones resonate. So we kind of have a model in our brains about where we're trying to head. And then based on that, identify sort of key phrases that we as a group agree need to be in the mission statement, and then stop there as a group, ask somebody in the room who likes to wordsmith to go away and come back in a couple of days with a couple of different examples, and then we kind of go through the vetting process from there. So it's not necessarily super duper fun, but it does get to the end point. And one of the great questions to ask in a mission statement exercise, either in the participant survey or in the moment, and as you're facilitating and putting your mission statement together, is how would the world be different if we didn't exist? And going with that absentia question is always a really good one. So that gets your brains thinking on the contrary from, why do we exist as an organization? What's our purpose? And that really, I think that's really useful. I also think, with mission, and then we'll wrap on this, I think with mission, it really does matter that the organization, actually for mission and vision, that you craft statements that are useful. That they actually tell you what your core purpose is and answer the question what's within our scope, so to speak, and what's not within our scope. And the same thing with vision. I think the problem with vision from time to time is we do a little bit too much magical thinking. And so when the work comes back and we look at it a month later, we feel like it's too Pollyanna. And so I think it's important to do the big, pie in the sky, creative work, because that's important for the engagement process and also just for the what-if process. But it's important to kind of bring it a little bit closer to earth, such that when you present it to your board or you present it to your shareholders or the whole organization, that we can actually see the reality in making that vision happen, or with the mission that we can actually use it to help define what we should and shouldn't do.
And it's really interesting because the question is, how do we create a creative, engaging type of exercise for the team? And again, if you're doing that, and if you're at the process where you're developing those ideas on what your purpose is, how you serve your customers, then the critical thing is to let the ideas flow, collect the thoughts, the themes, and so forth. But you don't have to wordsmith right on the spot. And I think that's what people get caught up in, is actually trying to write that sentence that sounds perfect. So, very good question.
Cool, great question. And we were a little long on that, but it's a big one.
We have somebody that contributed on here with the chat. I'll go ahead and read that. It says, it sounds like more of an icebreaker to get you in the mood to work through this process. A fun opening exercise to help people begin to think outside the box is to have people try to answer riddles. Googling something like creative thinking exercises produces a lot of options. Do that, then move into the focus on vision or mission. So in my mind, I'm reading that as get people to think a little bit outside of their normal way of thinking in the day-to-day.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks for contributing that. I think one thing that we forget about from time to time is that preparedness, like the preparedness to have the conversation, whether it's the thinking mode or the pre-prep work around what is mission and vision, just kind of the readiness to be there. So that's a great point.
Very good input.
Thank you. I know we have a couple more pre-submitted questions, but before we take them, just want to remind everyone to please, if there's something that's on your mind that you'd like to be addressed, please pop it in the chat box. If you have something to contribute, such as the last individual, please do so. We'd love to hear it.
Great. So the next question, we struggle with the ongoing communication around the strategic plan. Can you give me some ideas on how to keep the plan exciting? That's a very good question, and so many of our clients deal with this area, the implementation execution, because that's what it is. It's actually implementing the plan in the organization and then consistent execution so that you have a successful outcome at the end. But, ongoing communication, actually getting around some solid, a good schedule for reporting, the quarterly business review meetings, if you have monthly meetings with your managers so that you're constantly getting progress on their accomplishments. Make those exciting and have them conversational type meetings. One of the worst things that we could do is come in and feel like we have to report out on all of the metrics and everything. Actually reporting in a conversation style, maybe on a monthly, even weekly if your company's structured that way, but then having those quarterly business reviews. Again, going to our virtual strategy guide, there's some excellent implementation and execution tools there that can help you, agendas for your meetings, how to conduct the meetings, how to keep them active, how to keep your attendants and participants engaged in it. Keeping the plan exciting throughout the organization is just having the plan in front of them. Maybe some friendly competitions amongst departments. I just mentioned that to a client today. I was on a meeting with a client, and I said, it's a great time to have some fun competition amongst your departments. Friendly competition is healthy within an organization. So even if you throw out some funny, silly prizes for certain things, it keeps the plan fun. And that's what it's about also. As adults, we don't lose a sense for wanting to have some fun. So why not have it in business? So this particular individual was looking for a way to keep the plan in front of his group, and how can he keep them engaged, and that's what we discussed about keeping the participation in the plan somewhat competitive on a very friendly basis. So what are your thoughts, Erica?
I love that. I mean, we've been thinking a lot about that too on the, that friendly competition is great. And I think, so a couple of things adding on to that. One is there's one of the YouTube, the recent video snippets that are hosted on YouTube addresses specifically communicating your plan. So I'm going to speak in word pictures for a minute, but there's actually visual pictures that are part of that video. But I think it's really important to have a communication matrix so that you have down your, let's just say your Y, so down like, the Y axis, if you will, would be your audiences, and across the top in your columns on your X-axis would be the different reports, if you will, and I hate to say reports because that sounds boring already, of course, but at any rate, so I think that there's different modes that you need for different audiences. So one of the things that we do is we create a 2-pager little pretty, we call it the pretty sheet of the strat plan for all staff communication, for example, when the strategic plan is rolled out. And then the progress against that plan it's used as well with just the stoplights, and that serves the purpose of just that fun communication to the whole organization, and making it visually engaging, quite honestly. When we move up through the organization, I think that fundamentally keeping the plan exciting is that those quarterly business review meetings are exciting because you're talking about strategy, and that in and of itself can be exciting. It's not exciting to go to a reporting meeting. So I think that that's something to think about as well. And then, Elsa already mentioned the friendly competition. One of the organizations that we work with for their quarterly business reviews highlights those teams that have either the most green goals or the most accomplished goals, or whatever the case may be is. So that always spurs on a little bit of fun. And so the dash. Sorry, that's the last thing. Using the dashboard.
My apologies.
That's
a great one.
Plan dashboard also was intended to make interfacing with goals and status against the goals more fun than documents. So awesome. Good question.
Very good. So how are we?
One more, right, Ryan?
Yep, we got one more question here. If we have any other that anybody would like live, go ahead and use the chat function or raise your hand. We can open it, but we have one more question here. We'll answer and go from there.
So we've been publishing quite a few newsletters on the SWOT, and this question is about that. How do we go about a full SWOT, all stakeholders? I don't want to just ask questions to start with. Should I be broad in questions or narrow and focused? So I think it's important to think about your stakeholders almost in concentric circles. So you have your customers and your partners, and then you have your staff, you have your executive team, and you have your board if you have a board. And I think the way in which you engage those different stakeholder groups depends on, and the size of them, quite honestly, depends on the type of questions that you ask. And so one of the things we've been talking a lot about lately is that the information that you're gathering from your stakeholder group needs to be central to the strategic questions and the strategic shifts that you are trying to figure out, and not just be an off-the-shelf set of questions about, what should the goals be, and what do you think about the mission, that type of stuff. So while we need those answers, we also need to get feedback on what I would call those central strategic issues. That is why you're embarking on your plan in the first place. But Elsa, you're knee-deep on this stuff too, so what's your perspective?
When they do have that type of focus, it's easier to put it together. When it's very broad, a SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So for those of you that haven't dealt with a SWOT, what is it, first of all? We want to identify what those core competencies are within our organization. So if we're dealing with some very strategic issues, some problems that our company is facing with, what are those strengths, those core competencies that will help us mitigate or tackle those strategic issues that we're dealing with? So pull those out, focus on those energies. And then weaknesses, what are those, maybe those areas that we need to really improve on, shore up, strengthen, so that we are able to tackle those key strategic issues that we are having to face or that we're facing. And then the opportunities, what is it out there that we can capitalize on? And those are opportunities and threats are external to our organization. So ask those questions, again, that pertain to those strategic issues that we're facing, and what are the opportunities out external to our company that we can capitalize on that, again, will help us maybe mitigate or take advantage of while addressing those key issues. And then again, the threats. What are those key areas, those those issues that we're facing, and what do we need to do in order to mitigate them. All of these areas convert to goals, but again, just as Erica said, what are those key issues that we're battling right now? One question that gets tossed around a lot amongst us to our customers, our clients, is, what keeps you up at night? And so a SWOT really needs to respond to that in those 4 categories. If you're trying to keep the focus very narrow, again, if you're doing a broad base for your company, then you really need to evaluate all of the elements in each of those 4 quadrants. What is it that are those core competencies? What are the things that we really need to work on to improve so that we can be positioned well to tackle those strategic issues? And then what are those things we really want to capitalize on that's out there? If those issues are out there, there must be some other opportunities that we can also focus on. So your thoughts, Erica, anything that I've missed?
No, I think that was super comprehensive, and I think the point would be that on the gathering of the information in order to populate your SWOT should be based on how you want the level and depth that you're hoping to go to, as Elsa just mentioned, in the different areas of the organization. And of course, we're using the SWOT framework to help us put them in buckets, quite honestly. And what we like to do is we like to do a combination of open-ended questions and quantitative questions, of course. And I do think there's different questions to ask different people in the organization based on, where they sit and what their perspective is. So great question. I think it's it's part of the process that can be a little bit, this is the part of the process that can blow up really big if you're not careful. You're opening up the funnel for a ton of information, and so being super mindful about that as well is important, and sort of, I guess, blocking out the time to process it all. It needs to be warranted, and that's why I think one of our longer segments in our planning process, going back to the beginning question, is around stakeholder feedback and then processing that into the SWOT. So with that in mind, I think we've gone through all the questions, Ryan. Is that true?
Yeah, let me double check, but I believe so. Yeah, we're all set. And there's no other live questions, so we could go ahead and wrap up.
Okay, let's do that. So thanks to everybody that's on the line today. Really appreciate your submitting those questions in advance. Elsa, it was great to work with you. We just love Elsa's perspective, and Ryan for organizing this all of the time. It has been for the past almost 3 years. As you can see on the slide, we are going to be transitioning the Huddle into a different mode, and so more to come on that. We're still working out the details, but when we have it, we will certainly let you know. Of course, follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Tons of information available on our resource section on MyStrategicPlan, and as Ryan mentioned, we will send out a follow-up email with a link to the recording as well as the supporting slides. So, any closing comments, Elsa?
No, I think this is excellent. I thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to the next series or great tools that we've got planned for you. Thanks so much.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone.